Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Reality Check, where we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. In view of Chesterton's remarks that education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another generation, we're confronted with the paramount significance of education and its impact on civilization. It's quite interesting to see the explosive success of classical liberal education and what that means for society. And so I'm extremely excited to welcome on the show Martin Cothran from Memoria College and Memoria Press to discuss these issues. Professor Martin Cothran is editor of the Classical Teacher magazine and author of Memoria Press's Traditional Logic, Material Logic, Classical Rhetoric, and Lingua Biblica. He has taught Latin, logic, rhetoric at the Latin High School in Louisville, in Kentucky, and has been widely quoted on public policy issues by Reuters, USA Today, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. The Lexington Herald leader actually called him the master of the 30-second soundbite, and I want to put him to the test. Welcome, Martin.
Good to be here.
So first things first, how did you get involved with education, and how did you become such a great soundbite spitter?
I was thinking about this the other day. I have a journalism background. I mean, our college, University of California college newspaper, which was also the local newspaper. Daily paper. I was an editorials editor there, and that experience of just the journalism background and knowing how to say things in a way that a regular person could understand, and taking some kind of sort of more complex concepts and putting it in, using analogies, for example. I have a little to-do list that comes up on my computer every day. And one of the things that's up there every day, that it says, remember your metaphors. And then I just do put it to the next day. This is, and somebody who's taught logic for many and authored textbooks on the subject, I realized the other day, analogy is really the best way to argue anything, but put this formal logic aside, right? And you use that in, and I'm not from the South originally, but am a Southern adoptee, south of the United States. And analogy is everything. Metaphor is everything in the language people speak here. And you really notice that if you move from someplace else. So just in terms of communication, a good metaphor will do the job every time. But yeah, I was in banking for a few years, and then I had an interest in, because of my journalism background, in public policy. So I became a policy analyst many years ago on the state level here in Kentucky. And as we were talking about before the show, I was there was a really significant school reform measure here that had national consequences, and we started looking at it and realizing that all this stuff had been tried about 3 times before in the United States. There's a big national education reform movement every 25 years, almost exactly, in the United States, and it has continued since then. And every time they come with stuff they tried before that didn't work. They don't even, sometimes they repackage it. Sometimes they use the same slogans. And it was this whole, sort of Deweyite progressivism, which is interested in using schools to change the culture, and a vocationalism, which is really inconsistent with it. Dewey really wrestled with that here, and which is not about using schools to change the culture, but using schools to fit children to the culture, to, vocational instruction. It's school, the purpose of school is to get a job. And so we realized we had the 4th iteration of this in our school reforms, and we articulated that in televised debates and all these other things. We actually won, strangely enough. But but with the public school education here, it doesn't matter if you win. It's the blob. It just takes the energy you use against it and incorporates it within itself and continues on. So basically, we won. There was a sort of a pendulum swing back, the more traditional view of education. But as Diane Ravitch, the education writer, points out, this pendulum swing never goes as far back. And so and then it comes again and pushes things at the what I would call educational left, and you get this ratchet effect. And so that has just continued on here. But that's how I got involved in education, is through the whole public policy angle and the big debate here in our state on education reform.
Understood. Well, it's fascinating that you say that this debate seems to be reoccurring every 25 years, which is classically the way to measure a generation. And it occurs to me that once it's effective, then everything for the future is ruined. And I kind of approach from a different angle, because I just see that, and I mean, I have this with students all the time, and because we have this very scientist and even evolutionary way of looking at the world in our society, it seems that we kind of forget that all truths have to be learned again by every generation, right? There is no effective, hive mind, which just kind of gives us the information or the knowledge that we know, or the education, but rather we have to learn from step one. And I mean, if you have children, it's very easy. I mean, every single word has to be learned. And so you get reminded of that very basic fact of human existence. So it's interesting that you mentioned that these come in waves. It's not surprising, to be honest. So now, what you said something interesting there. You said that the schools are, they wanted the schools to be, or education to be to get a job. Okay. Well, if that's not the case, then what is education for?
Well, I think I could say a classical perspective, it's to become more of a human being, more of the ideal of a human being. I think that seems to me the only real way the only real way of viewing education, because schools are not the best place to get job skills, ironically. And the ways in which some of these people want to use it to change society is also along lines that most of us would not agree with. So really, we want to be better human beings. And this is why, for example, education, why subjects such as literature and history, I think, have been dropped from the curriculum, is because those are the subjects that helped us to do that. The ideals and values of our culture. And so we talk about becoming a better human being on the one hand, and I should also add, because really there are two purposes, classically speaking, traditionally speaking, for education. One is to develop a better human being, and the other is to pass on your culture. Right? That's the sort of broader purpose of education. And so we do that both individually and on the cultural level through literature and history, because that's the way we pass on our ideals and values, where we get them. You can teach them in an abstract way to people, but you really don't learn them so much as you imbibe them. And I think that's the virtue of literature and history, is that you see them enacted out in front of you. It's not just an abstraction. And of course, children are more concrete than adults are. So this is even more important for them, because it's making those ideals and values concrete. And so that's the role of schools. If you want to say that people go to school to get a job, well, in a certain sense, you could say that, because you're learning things that make you a better human being, and most employers want good human beings, right? But even in a specialized economy, you really the training that you get is really through on-the-job training. Schools in the United States, anyway, I don't know how they are in Europe, but they are not very technologically proficient. So they're probably not good places to get technological training. In many cases in the United States, students know more about technology than teachers do. So you're not going to do a great job of preparing them for the modern economy, which changes, as Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, said, about every 10 minutes. You need deep skills that you can use on anything, and I think that's what the traditional concept of education took account of.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I actually have practical examples of this, of acquaintances. Some of them studied philosophy and theology. They ended up going to work in economics, but they were actually hired because they were set apart from the competition by their philosophical or theological degree, and the employer had as much kind of, I guess, experience or just know-how to realize it's actually important to have somebody that is culturally educated, because they can always learn the economical skills that they need for the job, but you cannot necessarily learn the cultural skills, which is actually kind of makes you depressed when you think about it, that the schools are the channels of our culture. It's like, wow, well, then we're not so well for the next generation. I mean, you would obviously be an exception working for Memoria, but that goes without saying.
Well, and also there's this, what people don't understand is that most jobs, even in a tech company, are communications jobs. They're customer service, they're marketing, this sort of thing, which requires a competence in communication, which is not a technical skill, so to speak. You need to know human beings. And, if you just read Shakespeare and Dickens, I think between them, you would probably have all major personality types. So you would never meet a stranger, and when you're having that conversation with a person trying to maybe sell them something, if you've read Pride and Prejudice, say, that little dance that's going on where between Darcy and was it Elizabeth? I haven't read it in a while. Every word counts. One wrong word, and the trajectory of these two lives changes completely, right? I mean, that's great training. One wrong word can ruin the sale.
Yeah.
So I think, that's important to remember. The other important thing to remember is that some things, there's a book that came out recently called Range, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein, David Epstein. And he points out that there are some things that benefit from specialized training and other things that don't. And it's the things that thrive from specialized training are things where the rules never change, where the rules are very straightforward. But the tech economy is not that. The tech economy is the other kind of thing where it's changing all the time. The rules change all the time. You're much better with a generalized background to handle that kind of situation, even in a technical job. My philosophy major son is a principal software developer for a top 40 company. My second son, who's also a philosophy minor, exercise physiology major, is a principal software developer for the U.S. Soccer Federation. They none of them had technical backgrounds, and they tell me that this is common, not just I mean, in fact, my oldest son would say it's the prevalent thing, really, that a lot of the people, they don't have a computer science degree.
Yeah. That's incredible. That is very hopeful for anybody who could enjoy or has the possibility of getting a classical education. Now, that neatly brings me along, actually. I do feel that there is some kind of rise and some kind of explosion in the interest of classical education. Where do you say that hunger comes from? So is that just being, disillusioned with the school system as it is? Is there some deeper urges? Like, where would you locate the rise? And maybe can you even give a practical example from experience working with Memoria? How the formation actually works out and works for the better.
Well, so in the United States, public schools really are failing, and that has resulted in, the rise of the school choice movement, providing public money for private education. We're going through that right now in our state, an election next Tuesday, a ballot proposal to do that. But I think so. What you're seeing is a rise in interest in private education in general, and then on top of that, within private education, you're seeing a huge interest in classical education. I would say that at least 90% of all new private schools are classical schools. They're popping up everywhere because a classical school can articulate something distinct and different, right, than what you're seeing certainly in public schools. I mean, in the United States, we had public schools for many years. They were Protestant up until about the early 1960s, and this wasn't the cause of it. I think it was more the result of it. But there was a Supreme Court decision about prayer in the public schools. You couldn't do it anymore, and so you had private Protestant schools starting because public schools had become secular. In the meantime, you had all these Catholic schools because they founded themselves because public schools were Protestant. So that's at the beginning of the 20th century. So what you had happen now is, Catholic schools are closing here in the United States at an alarming rate because they basically adopted a lot of the type of education that public schools were doing anyway. Right. And Protestant schools are closing for financial reasons all over the place as well. But in the midst of that, you see this rise in classical schools and opening of these schools all over the country who have a coherent education philosophy that they can articulate. And so I think that's what accounts for it, is we're the only one with a coherent educational message.
Very, very good. Yeah, no, this is very interesting to hear. Now, I'm a philosopher. You have a background in teaching logic, so there is something I think we can go a little bit in depth into, and there's obviously much to say about the value of classical education, the different areas even of the classical curriculum that touch on the human person and their formation in virtue, in knowledge, in understanding, for sure. One of the things that is maybe overemphasized in modern school education is this idea of critical thinking. And this is something that's particularly interesting to me because from a philosophical point of view, you have different ways of understanding, well, what it means to critically think and to think critically. And so I think we're aware of one of the most proponents of this critical thinking that entered the US educational system, which is Paulo Freire, so the Brazilian Marxist, who basically taught that critical thinking allows the children to find and discern contradictions in their life, in the economic structures that they're going to be introduced to in society, and then develop the proper responses, in detecting them and then in responding to them, but all from a Marxist framework, which is highly negative in the way that it works on the deconstruction of pre-existing systems and so forth. So first of all, I guess my first question then would be, what do you think is the essence of critical thinking? And then maybe we can answer some of the more specific challenges that come with it afterwards. So what is critical thinking?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because my thesis on critical thinking has always been that nobody knows what it means. You ask somebody who uses the term, what do you mean by that? And they cannot give you a coherent account of it. It's because it's what it has become is I think, promotional slogan for failing schools, really, because it sounds good, sounds like there's something there, but you scratch just right below the surface and you realize they have an account of this. It's a promotional slogan. Here in the United States, high school sports and college sports are very popular, and there's cheerleaders out there with their pom-poms. And basically what's going on is this is the shaking of pom-poms, the whole critical thinking, all this critical thinking rhetoric. You say, excuse, you interrupt a cheerleader in the middle of her routine and you say, can you explain when you say sis boom, rah, rah, sis boom, bah, what exactly do you mean by that? And you get the blank stare you get from asking somebody what they mean by critical thinking. So if uh, so you rhetoric. I mean, I literally I have a whole shelf of books here in my library that I'm in right now on critical thinking, and I still don't know what it really means. All it can mean. Look, what do we have a reason and an imagination. That's what we have. So we have rational discourse that we have to master, which in its most concrete form is logic. And we have an imagination we have to develop, which we do by reading history and literature. Those are the two ways you develop your mind. So if I had to use the term critical thinking, which I just really don't do because it's hard to define, I like to use other terms and study logic and read widely. That's going to develop your critical faculties better than anything else. And so I think this whole idea, and if some of these books get into metacognition, what's called metacognition, which is the idea is thinking about thinking. And so the more we think about how this is the premise behind these programs, is the more we think about thinking, the better we'll be able to think. No, actually, the more you think about other things, the better off you will be able to think. Right? But this metacognition idea that we're supposed to be thinking about thinking all the time, and this will help us think, it makes absolutely no sense to me. We'd be far better off studying, say, formal logic, mathematics on the quantitative side, and just reading the great books and encountering the questions you find there and thinking about them yourself. If I had to put together a thinking skills program, that's what I would recommend.
That is a very persuasive answer. Well, if I had to give an answer, I mean, I would refer back to the Kantian idea, kind of the master of critique, and certainly the critical thinkers that use that word today. The Frankfurt School, the 68 in Germany on the one hand, but then also Freire on the Marxist school on the other hand. I think they would both agree that you go back to Kant. But what is Kant? Well, specifically that is the attempt to reflect back on the categories of thought. But in a certain way, you will never depart from that kind of introspection. So yeah, sure, you will have a very elaborate, very deep, very profound structure, like a nexus or like a matrix of different categories of the mind that you can all kind of, I don't know, rearrange in the way that you like it or you think is fit. But you'll never actually touch on the things in themselves, right? In the Kantian term, you never really encounter, well, the world outside. So
it's the two worlds.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's precisely what you're inviting us to do as well. If you read the stories, if you read the kind of the paradigmatic stories, the universal stories, the timeless stories, that's what will get you in touch with the world. I mean, that is the world because that's not you, and that nourishes the imagination. So of the two, would you say that imagination is more proper to the child and reason more to the adult, that one fades into the other? Or would you say that both kind of coexist in the child and in the adult, but to a different amount? Or is one building on the other? Like, how would you describe imagination and reason and their relation?
Well, it's interesting. I actually have thought a lot about this recently because I have 5 going on 6 grandchildren, and I'm reading to them. And just to, I had my 2.5-year-old over the other day, and I was reading to him Pinocchio. And just to look at his face as he's listening to this story, something very concrete. And yet it's introduced what a puppet becoming a real boy. There's all kinds of metaphysical implications to that, right? But you can't talk about those metaphysical implications, which is at the top end of thinking,
Right.
something you would have to do by getting formal training in it. But there are concrete things, these abstract things concretized that you can do, that you can present to a child. There's so many prerequisites to being able to think like Immanuel Kant. Right. I mean, and I say that as one of the few people who actually read the Critique of Pure Reason in school. It was many years ago, and I probably wouldn't attempt it. But I do think that we want to start at the top so many times. We get the order of learning wrong. We don't make the distinction between the order of knowledge and the order of learning. In the order of knowledge, you start at the top, right? You that's the priority. In the order of learning, you start at the bottom. You got to work your way up to the top. It's an inverse relation, and I think that's one of the mistakes we make in education all the time. Is we confound that distinction between the order of learning and the order of knowledge.
Yeah. That is a very deep insight, and I feel this happens to me all the time with students. And there's a very, I think, very simple experiment to test out what you just said, which is have them explain something that they just proposed, right? So you ask a question in class, and you have them give an answer, and then they come up with an answer, as good as it could be, or as bad as it could be. But then you probe and see how much they actually understood. And oftentimes the answer may be very good. And usually it's the more precise and the better the answer, the least the student actually understands what they have just said. And I had those moments in my life myself where I read something or I was taught something in university and I thought I understood it. Right. So you okay. And I'm not talking about like dates. I'm talking about, okay, well, the Cartesian dualism. And you hear that. And that's obviously an abstraction of an abstraction. So there's a categorization of a school of thought. Okay, well, the Cartesian dualism, and then you learn about the res extensa and the res cogitans and the body and the soul and how they're related or not related. And okay, and I think I've understood it. But I've discovered that I did not understand it. And I discovered that in the moment when I did understand it, which I could not cause. I was just sitting at lunch, and I remember this very distinctly in the cafeteria. And I was kind of zoning out from the conversation. It was like a bioethical conversation, just got into the more gruesome details. I was like, I just want to have my lunch here. And so I was just kind of sitting there eating my lunch. And then it kind of struck me almost like a lightning bolt. Be like, wait a second, like the Cartesian dual, that's a huge problem. This is tectonic, right? In its shift in the philosophy of history. And then I had to learn that it is in fact tectonic in the shifts of understanding man and the unity of body and soul. And well, I mean, we see much of the repercussions today of this disassociation of body and soul. Okay, well, we're not going to get into that, but so it's really striking that there is a difference of knowledge and understanding. And I feel like I think that's what you're touching on here. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I was thinking about when you were talking, there is a virtue to studying philosophy somewhat chronologically, of having some idea of the history of philosophy, because that insight comes late. That's a modern insight. And you probably need to be grounded in a little bit of the philosophy that came before that, the Platonic, Aristotelian, in order to think about that better, right? Because it's hard to manufacture insights. They just happen. But they will happen more often if you have a wide grounding in history of thought, so that you can at least see the context of that point that Descartes makes and that Kant makes. You have to have context. You have to know what so many times we give answers to students who don't know the questions.
Yeah.
Right? You have to know the questions. And so I just we get so many things wrong in education, and I think we talk about the causes of that, but I think you need a broad context within which to think anything, and that's, I think, where we fail so many.
Yeah. No, this mixing up of the bottom at the top, I think it's just it's ubiquitous, and it's amazing. I mean, yesterday I watched the Am I Racist? The new documentary by Matt Walsh, and there was one. I mean, he does these. It's incredible. I mean, it's really, there's a skill to this.
Yes.
Certainly that he certainly has, but he goes into, and he's completely dead faced, right? And he goes into these conversations with people that he probably fundamentally disagrees with. But there was one particular instance of a PhD philosophy student, quite young, well, not student anymore. I mean, PhD, so doctorate, but I mean, she was younger. And the way that she spoke, she used all of these really, really dense, complex terminology. But the way she spoke, you could feel that she did not understand what she was saying. And I mean, Matt Walsh, in his own little way, obviously points out those discrepancies, right? And the cognitive dissonance that goes along with it. So sure, he does that, but and that's a good thing. That's very, very useful. But it was just incredible to see how somebody, it's basically like having a student in the exam who has memorized a lot of things, but then when you just go to the next level, you realize, wow, understood nothing. But I really like what you said about the fabrication of insights. That's such a rich. That is a very rich understanding. Okay, well, let's go back to education, though. So for parents who do not have the possibility of sending their school to like the children, sorry, to a classical education school, I mean, what can they do, and how? Is it even possible to found new schools like this? In your experience, how difficult is it? I mean, does it have a future?
Well, yes. I think there's a misunderstanding about why it's hard to found a new private school. We think that the problem is money or a facility or finding qualified instructors or other. Actually, and this is a failing school is likely to have one big glaring major weakness, and that is its curriculum. Mm-hmm. People do not understand the value of and by curriculum, you go to public school. What's your curriculum? Well, there's some lesson plans on our website. No, a curriculum is a sequencing of subjects that is put together in a coherent way that builds from the simple to the complex and follows that order of learning. And this is the most widely understood thing. So, therefore, if I'm correct about that, and that is the major factor which will determine the success or failure of a school, you have to have a curriculum. That has to be at the core of what you do. Right now, the facilities are not unimportant. Money is not unimportant. Other ancillary things you do in education are not unimportant. But the central thing is the curriculum, which is why I think you can be successful as a home educator. And this is a huge thing in the United States. There are millions of children being homeschooled because parents don't have a private school to go to, or they can't afford it. And the public school disaster area. And so they homeschool. And it's even more important in a homeschool to have a good curriculum, which is where I put my focus over the years is in curriculum development and that sort of thing, which we've done at Memorial Press. And so we're now a couple generations down in the United States. Homeschooling is a significant cultural force. And so I get invited to speak at these homeschool conferences here, which can be rather large. One of our conferences had almost 20,000 people. That's how popular it is in the United States. And so I talk with parents who have been doing this now. They raised a child. They're now in college. They homeschooled them. These homeschooling mothers. And I have said this before, and I'll keep saying it. homeschooling mothers are going to save the world because they have taught their own children and therefore learned, they will all say this, I got the education I never had in teaching my own children. And so you have all of these former homeschooling mothers out there looking for something to do. And I told my friends in the private schools, I've said this 20 years ago, I said, watch, you can't find the Latin teacher you need at your school to teach Latin. Give it 5 years, give it 10 years, and you're going to have former homeschooling mothers who taught Latin to their own children using a good curriculum knocking on your door. And sure enough, that's exactly what it's. All these private schools are employing former homeschooling mothers to teach at their school, despite the fact that they have no formal qualifications to do it, because most people with formal qualifications, have been taught how to educate the wrong way anyway. So this has become a big feeder for private schools in the United States, is these homeschooling mothers who got the education they never themselves got in school.
Yeah, that is certainly my experience. And mentioning the Memorial curriculum, I mean, we're starting with it now with our 5-year-old, and it's even, that you learn the letters not in sequence, but you learn first I and then A, or first A maybe, and then I and then M, and then you want like why do you not do A B C? Well, because that's the first word. I am, right? You can form your first short sentences and then the rhymes thereof. And it's spectacular what kind of detail a syllabus can be thought out. So experiencing it now is really quite something. I have a pivotal question. Maybe this could be we're moving towards the end here, a closing remark, but you mentioned classical education, which obviously dates back way into the antiquity. Along with Latin and Greek. But would you say that classical education is tied in some way necessarily to, Christian revelation, to a Christian worldview? Or can there truly be, let's say, a pagan classical education? How would you tackle that?
Well, I think obviously, historically, what we see when we look back is that you had the great Greek thinkers, and there was an education system, I guess you could say, in Greece and certainly in Rome, and then you had the church coming along, and then having to say, okay, we want to educate. What do we do? And you had this whole sorting out, Origen and the Cappadocian Fathers, Augustine, and some other people in the West, in addition, basically having to realize that, not that those thinkers had any trouble doing it, but a lot of other Christians did, realizing that the pagans had truths that they had discovered through natural revelation, and that those things were not only true, but in many cases good. And so you had this whole thought process of coming to terms with pagan education. And then I think the realization that Christianity in many ways is the culmination of that. I mean, you can just take, the virtues, you have the cardinal virtues, and nobody disagrees with those, certainly not Christians, but there's also the Christian virtues, which tend to complete the pagan virtues. And so I think, ironically, it was the Christian church through which the ancient classical education survived at all. That was the system of Christian education, particularly starting the Carolingian Revolution and on into the High Middle Ages, where it was Christians who were sorting through Aristotle and Plotinus and Plato and all that, and taking account of it, because all those things were pointers to the ultimate truth, which had been directly revealed to the church. So I think historically, certainly, you'd say that they're absolutely, completely intertwined. We would not have classical education. We would not have the thought of the pagans if it weren't for Christianity. And that's not just taking two alien things and packaging them together. They are completely intertwined because truth can be revealed in two different ways. The same truth can be revealed in two different ways. It can be revealed naturally as it was to the pagans, directly as it was to the church, and so they're not alien to each other. They're both avenues to the truth, and they correspond in many different ways. So that's what we have now is our whole education system, insofar as it's real education and not what I would call fake education, is beholden to the church. Wouldn't have it without the church. So we're the natural people to retake this up again and go back and again collect the old things that were once a part of education and make them a part of it again in a way that the secular world would never think to do.
Yeah, lots of food for thought there. That's for sure. Maybe we can end on this beautiful image. You talked about analogies and images, but I do like this image taken from medieval, the early medieval schools, the cathedral schools, right? Who said that we are not able to see very far on our own because we're like dwarfs. But we're like dwarfs when we study, when we learn from the classics and the ancients. We're like dwarfs standing on the shoulder of giants, and that's why we can see in the far distance. So maybe that's a good image to end on.
I love it. I love that image.
Martin, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. I'm very much looking forward to continue the conversation also beyond the interview. I do direct all of the viewers to the Classical Teacher, that if you are interested in reading more what Martin read, or rather what he wrote, and what he's interested in and his research, you can go to that. Otherwise, check out Memoria College and Memoria Press. They're very prolific in their work with school curricula and also the revival of classical Christian education. Martin, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to touching base again, and have a good evening.
Thank you.